My name is Alexandra Morgan, and I'm 29 years old. The words hung in the air like poison at my parents' suburban dining table. Across from me sat my perfect sister Charlotte, her eyes wide with shock. "You're not half the woman your sister is," my father spat, his disappointment palpable. I pushed my chair back, the leg screeching against hardwood. Everyone froze. The silverware stopped clinking. My mother's breath caught. Charlotte's perfect posture crumbled. And I finally found my voice. Before I tell you what I did next, let me know where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you've ever felt compared to someone else in your life, and give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after 29 years of living in someone else's shadow. Growing up as Charlotte Morgan's younger sister was like living with a constant reminder of what perfection looked like. 3 years older than me, Charlotte set the bar impossibly high from the moment I could understand what achievement meant. Our childhood home in Westbrook was filled with her accolades, science fair ribbons, debate team trophies, swim meet medals, all displayed prominently in the living room where guests couldn't miss them. My modest art contest certificates were tucked away in a drawer in my bedroom. Charlotte was the embodiment of conventional success, structured, disciplined, and methodical. She followed rules to the letter, planned her life 5 years ahead, and executed those plans with military precision. Her bedroom was always immaculate, her homework completed days before deadlines. She graduated high school as valedictorian, sailed through an Ivy League education, and secured a position at Patterson & Geller, one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston. I, on the other hand, was what my father called a free spirit, which was never said with admiration. Where Charlotte was orderly, I was chaotic. While she excelled in math and science, I lost myself in art and literature. My room was a creative explosion, my homework often completed in bursts of inspiration the night before it was due. I thought differently, approached problems from unexpected angles, and frequently challenged authority, much to my parents' dismay. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. When Charlotte brought home perfect report cards, my parents would nod approvingly, as if nothing less was expected. When I brought home mostly A's with a B in math, the conversation inevitably turned to how Charlotte had never received anything less than an A in her life. "Alexandra has different strengths," my mother would say when company was over, as if apologizing for me. "Charlotte's our academic star, but Alex has creative tendencies." These creative tendencies led me to pursue graphic design, a career choice that mystified my parents. My father, Richard Morgan, was a corporate executive who measured success in promotions and salary increases. My mother, Evelyn, had been a pediatrician before retiring. Both regarded my freelance design business as a hobby I would eventually outgrow. "When are you going to get a real job with benefits?" my mother would ask during our weekly phone calls. "Charlotte's firm offers full health coverage and a 401k match." I'd built a modest but growing client base over the past 4 years, working with small businesses and a few promising startups. My portfolio was diverse, my reviews stellar. But in my parents' eyes, without an office and a fixed salary, I might as well have been unemployed. Last month, I lost Horizon Tech, a client that accounted for nearly 30% of my income. The startup had been acquired by a larger company with an in-house design team. It was a significant setback but not unusual in freelance work. I was already interviewing with new prospects, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Charlotte had just made junior partner at her law firm. Which is why I almost canceled on the monthly family dinner last Sunday. I knew what was coming, the subtle digs, the disappointed looks, the inevitable comparisons. But skipping would only postpone the inevitable, and my mother had been insistent. "Your sister has big news," she'd said over the phone. It would be rude not to come. So I arrived at their colonial-style house, bottle of wine in hand, stomach already knotted with anxiety. Charlotte's BMW was already parked in the driveway, gleaming like her accomplishments. The dinner started pleasantly enough. My mother had prepared roast beef, Charlotte's favorite, and my father opened an expensive bottle of Cabernet to celebrate her promotion. For 20 minutes, the conversation revolved entirely around Charlotte's accomplishment. Junior partner at 32, my father beamed. The youngest in the firm's history. The hours have been brutal, Charlotte admitted, cutting her meat into precise, even pieces. But the equity stake makes it worthwhile. And that corner office with a view of the harbor, my mother added. I've already ordered custom drapes. I nodded and smiled, pushing food around my plate, waiting for the inevitable pivot to my life. It came as my father poured himself a second glass of wine. So, Alexandra, he said, using my full name as he always did when disappointment was imminent. Your mother tells me you lost the Horizon account. Not how's your business going or any new clients lately. Straight to the failure. They were acquired, I explained, trying to keep my voice even. Their new parent company has an in-house team. It happens in freelance work. Such an unstable way to make a living, my mother sighed. All that talent, and you live paycheck to paycheck. I don't live paycheck to. Charlotte's firm weathered the recession without a single layoff, my father interrupted. That's security. Charlotte glanced at me apologetically. The corporate world isn't for everyone, Dad. Clearly, he snorted. But some basic financial planning wouldn't hurt. Charlotte owns her condo. Alexandra still rents that tiny apartment. It's in the arts district, I said. And I like it. You could afford twice the space in a better neighborhood if you joined that design agency that offered you a position last year, my mother pointed out. The agency had offered benefits and stability, but required designing corporate materials that would have crushed my soul. I'd turned it down to maintain my creative freedom, a decision my parents still hadn't forgiven. Have you thought about going back for an MBA? Charlotte asked, attempting to change the subject. Some of my clients with design backgrounds have done well in marketing. Even Charlotte's help felt like criticism. I forced a smile. I'm happy with what I'm doing. Happy doesn't pay the bills, my father muttered. I pay my bills just fine, I said, my voice sharper than intended. My mother's eyes widened at my tone. We're just concerned, Alexandra. You're almost 30, single, with an unstable career. We want what's best for you. Like Charlotte, my father added, gesturing toward my sister with his wine glass. She's got it all figured out. Charlotte stared down at her plate. Dad, please. What? It's true. Look at her, professional, successful, dating a doctor. She's set for life. The food on my plate had gone cold, but the rage in my chest burned hot. My work has value, Dad. Drawing pictures for companies that go out of business? He scoffed. Charlotte defends corporations worth billions. She just made junior partner. What have you accomplished lately? The room fell silent. My mother placed her hand over my father's, a warning he ignored. I'm just saying, he continued, the wine loosening his tongue, when are you going to get serious about your life? You're not half the woman your sister is. And that's when I pushed my chair back, the leg screeching against the hardwood floor. Everyone froze. The silverware stopped clinking. My mother's breath caught. Charlotte's perfect posture crumbled. And I finally found my voice. The silence that followed felt eternal. My chair stood at an awkward angle behind me, the table before me a battlefield of half-eaten food and unspoken resentments. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. My mother recovered first. Alexandra, sit down. Your father didn't mean. Yes, he did, I said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in my voice despite the earthquake happening inside me. He absolutely meant it. Charlotte stared at her wine glass, her knuckles white around the stem. My father's expression was a mixture of surprise and indignation, as if I'd broken some unspoken rule by not accepting his criticism with my usual silence. You're overreacting, he said, reaching for his wine. Sit down so we can finish dinner. But I remained standing, 29 years of swallowed words rising in my throat. The dining room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating with its formal wallpaper and chandelier that cast harsh shadows across everyone's faces. My mother's precious china plates, the matching napkins, the floral centerpiece, all pieces of this perfect tableau that I'd never quite fit into. 29 years, I said, my voice gaining strength. For 29 years, I've sat at this table and listened to how I don't measure up. That's not fair, my mother protested weakly. We've always supported you. Supported me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. By constantly comparing me to Charlotte? By dismissing my career, my choices, my entire way of living? Charlotte finally looked up. Alex. I'm not blaming you, I told her, and meant it. Charlotte had never asked to be the yardstick by which I was measured. But I can't do this anymore. The physical sensations were overwhelming, heat rising to my face, a pressure in my chest like something breaking open, my fingernails digging into my palms. But with the pain came clarity. For the first time in my life, I could see the situation for what it was. Do you have any idea what it's like? I asked, looking directly at my father. To come to dinner month after month, knowing that nothing I do will ever be good enough? He stared back, genuinely perplexed. We want what's best for you. We push you because you have potential you're wasting. No, I shook my head. You push me to be Charlotte. But I'm not Charlotte. I've never been Charlotte. And I never will be Charlotte. My mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. We know you're different, dear. We just worry about your future. My future is mine to shape, I said. I built a business doing work I believe in. I have clients who value my creativity, my perspective, my approach to design. Is it less prestigious than corporate law? Yes. Does it make me less valuable as a person? As a daughter? The question hung in the air. My father set down his wine glass with excessive precision. No one said you're less valuable. Don't twist my words. You're not half the woman your sister is, I quoted back to him. What exactly did you mean by that, Dad? His jaw tightened. I meant that you lack the drive and discipline that Charlotte has always had. You could do so much more if you applied yourself properly. The room seemed to tilt slightly. There it was, the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped our relationship. My father couldn't see that I had applied myself, just to different purposes than he valued. My hands were still shaking, but now with something that felt less like fear and more like power. My voice, when it came, surprised even me with its clarity. I am applied. I am driven. I am disciplined. Just not in ways you recognize or value. Charlotte pushed her plate away. She's right, Dad. Alex works harder than anyone I know. She just does it differently. My mother looked startled at Charlotte's intervention. My father's eyebrows drew together. This isn't about whose side you're on, Charlotte, he snapped. It's not about sides at all, I said. It's about respect. It's about recognizing that there's more than one path to a meaningful life. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, life continuing beyond the walls of this moment that felt so monumental to me. My father's expression hardened. If you want respect, you need to earn it. Charlotte. If you say Charlotte's name one more time, I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it, I'm walking out that door. My mother gasped. Alexandra. Don't threaten your father in his own house. The unfairness of it all, that standing up for myself was seen as a threat, while tearing me down was just parental concern, made something break loose inside me. 29 years of trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. You know what? I don't have to stay for this. I reached for my purse hanging on the back of my chair. I'm an adult. I get to choose how I'm treated. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my car keys. Everything inside me was vibrating with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. I'd never spoken to my parents this way, never claimed this kind of autonomy in their presence. If you leave now, my father warned, don't expect an invitation back until you've reconsidered your attitude. The ultimatum hung in the air between us. For a moment, I hesitated, decades of conditioning making me second-guess myself. But then I looked at Charlotte's face, saw the conflict there, and something crystallized inside me. My attitude isn't the problem, I said quietly. And if being treated with basic respect requires an invitation, then maybe I don't want to come back. My mother began to cry in earnest now. Alexandra, please. Let's not say things we'll regret. But I was already moving toward the foyer, grabbing my coat from the rack. Behind me, chairs scraped as my family rose from the table. You're being melodramatic, my father called after me. Just like when you were a teenager. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, turned back to look at them one last time, my father's angry face, my mother's tears, Charlotte's wide eyes. I'm being clear, I corrected him. For the first time in my life, I'm being absolutely clear about what I will and won't accept. And this, I gestured to the dining room tableau, isn't it anymore? Then I walked out, closing the door firmly behind me. The night air hit me like a physical shock. I stumbled to my car, fumbled with the keys, and somehow managed to start the engine. Tears blurred my vision as I backed out of the driveway. My phone started buzzing in my purse, probably my mother, possibly Charlotte, but I ignored it. I drove without direction, eventually finding myself at Riverside Park, where I'd spent countless hours as a teenager sketching the trees and water when the atmosphere at home became too oppressive. I parked and sat there, engine off, staring at the dark water reflecting the scattered lights of the city. And then, alone in my car, I finally allowed myself to break down completely. I don't know how long I sat in my car before the tears subsided enough for me to breathe normally again. My throat felt raw, my eyes puffy. The windows had fogged from my breath, creating a cocoon that separated me from the world outside. My phone had stopped buzzing. 5 missed calls, 3 from my mother, 1 from Charlotte, 1 from my father. I turned it off entirely. The digital clock on my dashboard read 9:47 p.m. Only 2 hours had passed since I'd arrived at my parents' house, yet it felt like a lifetime. I felt hollowed out, emptied of the emotions I'd carried for so long, yet somehow lighter for it. I rolled down the window, letting the cool night air clear my head. The park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few dog walkers and couples strolling along the illuminated paths. The river flowed silently, constant and unchanging despite the turmoil of human lives playing out around it. I hadn't planned to return to my parents' house. But as my breathing steadied and my thoughts cleared, I realized I wasn't finished. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for myself, but I hadn't said everything that needed saying. I'd walked out, but I hadn't walked away with closure. Before I could talk myself out of it, I started the car and pulled back onto the road. 20 minutes later, I was parking in front of the colonial house I'd fled earlier. Charlotte's BMW was still in the driveway. Lights glowed from the living room windows. They were still up, probably discussing my outburst. I sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Then I walked up the familiar brick path and rang the doorbell instead of using my key, a small but significant acknowledgement that I no longer took my welcome for granted. My mother answered, her eyes widening in surprise. Alexandra. Thank goodness. We've been so worried. May I come in? I asked formally. She stepped aside, confused by my tone. Of course, this is your home. No, I corrected her gently. This is your home. Mine is the apartment you don't approve of. I followed her into the living room where my father and Charlotte sat in tense silence. Charlotte jumped up when she saw me, relief visible on her face. My father remained seated, his expression guarded. You've come to apologize, then, he said, not a question but an expectation. I took a deep breath, centering myself. No, Dad. I've come to finish our conversation. My mother hovered anxiously between us. Maybe we should all take some time to calm down. I am calm, I said, and surprisingly, it was true. The drive back had crystallized something in me, a clarity I'd never experienced before. And I have things to say that I should have said years ago. I remained standing, unwilling to resume my usual place of deference by sitting. All my life, I've tried to earn your approval by your standards. I failed consistently because those standards were never designed for someone like me. My father opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up my hand. Please let me finish. For once, just listen. Remarkably, he closed his mouth. When I was 7, I won second place in the school art show. You asked why not first. When I brought home straight A's except for a B in calculus, you focused on the B. When I got into Rhode Island School of Design with a partial scholarship, you called it a consolation prize after I didn't get into Harvard like Charlotte. I turned to my mother. When I started my business, you called it playing at being professional. When I landed my first major client, you asked when I'd get benefits instead of congratulating me. When I was featured in Design Quarterly last year, neither of you mentioned it, though I know you saw the issue because Charlotte told me she showed it to you. Charlotte looked down, confirming the truth of this. My mother's expression faltered with guilt. Every achievement I've had has been measured against Charlotte's yardstick and found wanting. Not because my achievements weren't valid, but because you were measuring entirely different things. I turned to Charlotte next. And you saw it happening and mostly stayed silent. I don't blame you for their behavior, but your silence made you complicit. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. I know, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Alex. My father stood up now, his patience exhausted. This is ridiculous. We've supported you your entire life. Paid for art camp when you begged to go instead of math enrichment. Bought you a laptop for design work in college when what you really needed was business skills. Put up with your finding yourself phase after graduation. That wasn't support, I said quietly. That was tolerance. And even that came with constant reminders that my choices disappointed you. We wanted more for you, my mother cried. Is that so terrible? To want your child to be secure, successful? I am successful, I insisted. By my own definition. My work brings me fulfillment. My clients value my creativity and perspective. I built something from nothing. Isn't that the American dream you always talked about, Dad? He scoffed. Barely making rent while drawing logos isn't success. I make more than rent, I said. I've been saving for a down payment. I have health insurance, retirement contributions, emergency funds. I'm not struggling financially, I just don't flaunt wealth as a measure of worth like you do. This seemed to genuinely surprise him. You're saving for a house? A condo, I corrected. In my neighborhood, where I want to live, not in the suburbs where you think I should. An uncomfortable silence fell. I'd contradicted their narrative about my life, and they didn't quite know how to respond. Charlotte spoke into the silence. They didn't know, Alex. I tried to tell them you were doing well, but they... She trailed off. They preferred their version of my life, I finished for her. It justified their disappointment. My father's face flushed. Now you're just being cruel. No, Dad. Cruel is telling your daughter she's not half the woman her sister is. Cruel is making one child feel like she's a consolation prize in your life. Cruel is withholding approval for 29 years because someone doesn't fit the template you created for them. My mother began to cry. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times, but genuine, body-shaking sobs. We never meant to hurt you, she managed between breaths. We pushed because we thought you needed pushing. We compared because we thought it would motivate you. It didn't motivate me. It diminished me, I said, my voice breaking slightly. It made me doubt myself at every turn. It made me work twice as hard for half the recognition. Do you know what that does to a person over time? For the first time in my memory, my father looked uncertain. Not angry, not disappointed, uncertain. As if he was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't know what to make of the person standing before him. We're your parents, he said finally. We wanted what we thought was best. I know, I acknowledged. But what's best for Charlotte isn't what's best for me. And it's time, long past time, that you saw me for who I actually am, not who you wanted me to be. Charlotte stood and came to my side, taking my hand. She's right, she said, addressing our parents. You've always had different standards for us. I noticed it when we were kids, but I was too afraid of losing your approval to say anything. That was cowardly of me. My father looked from Charlotte to me and back again, visibly processing this unified front he'd never encountered before. I need to go, I said, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of it all. I've said what I came to say. Alexandra, please, my mother reached for me. Don't leave like this. I gently disengaged my hand from hers. I'm not cutting you out of my life, Mom. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. I moved toward the door, Charlotte following me to the foyer. I meant what I said, my father called after me. About needing to reconsider your attitude before coming back. I paused, turned to look at him one last time. And I meant what I said. I won't come back to be diminished. The choice is yours. Outside, the night air felt cleansing after the heated emotions of the house. Charlotte followed me to my car. I should have stood up for you years ago, she said, hugging herself against the chill. I was so afraid of losing their approval that I let them hurt you over and over. What kind of sister does that make me? I looked at her, really looked at her. Behind the perfect exterior, I saw something I'd never fully acknowledged before, Charlotte's own prison of expectations, different from mine but no less confining. One who was trapped in her own way, I said softly. This isn't just about me, is it? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You think it's been easy being the perfect one? The standard bearer? Do you know how terrified I've been of failing? Of making one wrong move and watching it all come crashing down? For the first time, I saw my sister not as the golden child who had everything handed to her, but as someone carrying her own impossible burden. We need to talk, I said. Really talk. But not tonight. I can't do any more tonight. Charlotte nodded, understanding. Call me when you're ready? I will, I promised, getting into my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Charlotte stood in the driveway, a solitary figure watching me leave. For once, I didn't feel jealousy or resentment, just a profound sadness for the relationship we might have had if we hadn't been pitted against each other from the start. The days following my confrontation with my family passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, taking on rush projects I would normally decline, working 14-hour days that left me too exhausted to think. My phone accumulated notifications I refused to address, texts, voicemails, emails, all from family members I wasn't ready to speak with. My mother's approach was persistence, daily messages alternating between guilt, I cried all night after you left, and concern, we just want to know you're all right. My father's strategy was predictable, one terse voicemail stating that when I was ready to be reasonable, we could talk. Charlotte was more respectful of my space, sending only a brief text, here when you're ready. No pressure. I responded to none of them. By day, I functioned on autopilot, creating logos, designing websites, developing brand identities. I took meetings, sent invoices, answered professional emails. I even landed 2 new clients to replace Horizon Tech. From the outside, I appeared to be thriving. But nights were different. Sleep became elusive, my mind replaying the confrontation on an endless loop. I'd vacillate between fierce pride and finally standing up for myself and gnawing doubt about the bridges I might have burned. The family I knew was deeply flawed, but they were still my family. Had I gone too far? Not far enough? Physical manifestations of stress appeared, tension headaches, a persistent knot in my stomach, a complete loss of appetite. I lost 5 pounds in a week, existing mainly on coffee and the occasional piece of toast when dizziness reminded me of my body's basic needs. On the 6th day after the dinner, I was sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by sketches for a brewery rebrand, when my doorbell rang. I ignored it, assuming it was a package delivery. When it rang again, more insistently, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. Rachel Baker, my closest friend since college, stood in the hallway, arms crossed, looking determined. "I know you're in there, Alex," she called through the door. "Your car's in your spot, and your desk lamp is visible from the street. Open up or I start singing show tunes in the hallway." Despite everything, a smile tugged at my lips. Rachel had been my roommate at RISD and knew all my hiding patterns. She also knew I couldn't stand her deliberately off-key rendition of Defying Gravity. I opened the door, and her determined expression immediately shifted to concern. "Jesus, Alex," she said, taking in my appearance. "You look terrible." "Always the charmer," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She carried a large paper bag that emitted savory aromas. "When you don't post anything for 5 days and don't answer texts, I know something's wrong. And when something's wrong, you don't eat. So I brought Thai from Basil Leaf." The mention of my favorite restaurant made my empty stomach growl traitorously. "I'm fine," I insisted, even as I followed her to the kitchen. "Just busy with work." Rachel unpacked containers of pad thai, green curry, and spring rolls, giving me a skeptical look. "Try that with someone who hasn't known you for a decade." Charlotte called me. I froze. "She what?" "Called me. Worried sick because you're not responding to anyone. Said something major went down at family dinner." She pushed a plate toward me. "Eat first, then talk." I wanted to resist, to maintain the protective isolation I'd built, but the combination of food and Rachel's no-nonsense concern broke through my defenses. I ate mechanically at first, then with increasing hunger as my body remembered what it had been missing. Rachel waited until I'd cleared half my plate before saying, "So, want to tell me what happened?" The story spilled out between bites: the dinner, my father's cutting remark, my walkout, my return and confrontation. Rachel listened without interruption, her expression shifting between outrage and sympathy. "Damn, Alex," she said when I finished. "That took serious guts." "Or temporary insanity," I mumbled, pushing rice around my plate. "No, it was long overdue. Your parents have been pulling this comparison crap since I've known you. Remember when they visited during junior year and your dad spent 20 minutes talking about Charlotte's summer internship at that law firm?" I nodded. That had been during our gallery showing, my first public exhibition of my work. My father had barely glanced at my pieces. "So what now?" Rachel asked. "Are you planning to talk to them?" I set down my fork. "I don't know. Part of me wants to never speak to them again. Another part feels guilty for exploding like that. They're not evil people, Rachel. Just limited in how they see me." "Limited is generous," she snorted. "But I get it. They're still your parents. And Charlotte." I trailed off. I'm not even sure how to feel about her anymore. She seemed genuinely worried when she called, Rachel offered. "Said she should have stood up for you years ago." I thought about Charlotte standing in the driveway as I drove away, the vulnerability I'd glimpsed beneath her perfect exterior. She's trapped in her own way, I guess. After Rachel left, extracting a promise that I'd at least text her daily to confirm I was eating, the apartment felt emptier than before. The brief connection had cracked the shell of isolation I'd built, making the loneliness that followed more acute. I tried to return to work, but focus eluded me. Instead, I found myself on the couch, staring at nothing, memories flooding back that I'd long suppressed. My 10th birthday, when my father gave me a calculator while Charlotte received art supplies because Alexandra needs to strengthen her math skills, despite my having expressed interest in drawing. My high school graduation, where my parents hosted a modest backyard celebration, compared to the catered affair they'd thrown when Charlotte graduated. The time I'd landed my first major freelance project, excited to share the news, only to have the conversation redirected to Charlotte's promotion within minutes. Hundreds of paper cuts that had accumulated over the years, each one small enough to dismiss individually but collectively forming a wound that had never fully healed. Around midnight, a knock at my door jolted me from these painful recollections. Wary after the emotional drain of Rachel's visit, I approached cautiously and looked through the peephole. Charlotte stood in the hallway, alone, looking uncharacteristically disheveled in jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual polished appearance. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, but something in her posture, a vulnerability I rarely associated with my confident sister, made me unlock the door. "It's late," I said by way of greeting. "I know. I'm sorry." She shifted uncomfortably. "Can I come in? Just for a few minutes?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. Charlotte entered, taking in the scattered evidence of my sleepless nights, coffee mugs on every surface, work materials spread across the floor, blankets piled on the couch where I'd been failing to sleep. "Rachel said you're not eating," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Rachel talks too much," I muttered. "I'm fine." Charlotte didn't push the point, instead wandering to my workspace where client projects were laid out. "These are incredible, Alex. The brewery redesign, it's brilliant." "Thanks," I said stiffly, and used to such direct praise from any family member. An awkward silence fell between us. Finally, Charlotte turned to face me. "I didn't come to check up on you." "Well, not only that. I came to say you're right. About everything." I leaned against the wall, suddenly too tired to stand unsupported. "That's not what I expected to hear." "I've had a lot of time to think this past week," she said, perching on the edge of my couch. "About how things have always been between us. How our parents set us up in competition from the beginning. How I benefited from that system and you suffered." "You didn't create the system," I said, surprising myself by defending her. "No, but I thrived in it. And I never challenged it." She looked down at her hands. "Do you know why I went to law school?" The question caught me off guard. "Because you're good at it? Because it's prestigious?" Charlotte laughed without humor. "Because Dad wanted to be a lawyer. His father couldn't afford to send him to law school, so he went into business instead. When I showed aptitude for debate in high school, he started talking about Harvard Law like it was a foregone conclusion." I stared at her, processing this new information. "But you love being a lawyer. Don't you?" "I'm good at it," she corrected. "There's satisfaction in being good at something. But love?" She shook her head. "I can't remember the last time I made a decision because I loved something rather than because it was expected of me." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, the perfect sister, the golden child, trapped in a life shaped by others' expectations. "What would you have chosen?" I asked softly. Charlotte was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. "Marine biology," she finally said. "I was fascinated by ocean ecosystems. Remember those summer trips to the Cape? While everyone was sunbathing, I was in the tide pools for hours." I did remember, Charlotte with her guidebooks, excitedly identifying creatures, more animated than I ever saw her at home. "Why didn't you ever say anything? And disappoint Dad? Break Mom's heart? Be anything less than perfect?" She shook her head. "I couldn't. By the time I might have had the courage, I was already locked in, student loans, career track, expectations." We sat in silence, the weight of her confession hanging between us. "I brought something," she said eventually, reaching for a tote bag I hadn't noticed. She pulled out a worn photo album with Morgan family embossed on the cover. "I took this from Mom's bookshelf before I left tonight. I thought, maybe you should see it." She placed it on the coffee table between us, then stood. "You don't have to look at it now. Or ever. But it's here if you want to." She moved toward the door. "I should go. It's late." "Charlotte," I called as she reached for the doorknob. "Thank you. For coming. For saying all that." She gave me a sad smile. "I should have said it 20 years ago." After she left, I stared at the album for nearly an hour before finding the courage to open it. Whatever it contained, I wasn't sure I was ready to face it tonight. Eventually, I turned off the lights and retreated to bed, leaving the album unopened on the table, a bridge between past and present that I wasn't yet ready to cross. 3 nights after Charlotte's visit, I found myself awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, sleep once again eluding me. The photo album sat on my coffee table where she had left it, untouched. Its presence had become almost physical, like another person in the apartment, silent but impossible to ignore. Finally, surrendering to the inevitable, I switched on my lamp and padded to the living room. I curled up on the couch, pulled a throw blanket around my shoulders, and opened the album. The first pages contained the expected formal portraits: my parents' wedding, Charlotte's birth, my birth, staged family photos in coordinating outfits through the years. But as I continued, I found something unexpected, page after page of moments I'd forgotten or never noticed. Charlotte at age 7, proudly holding up a drawing I'd made at 4, pointing to it with unmistakable big sister pride. The two of us building a sandcastle at Crane Beach, working together instead of competing, my artistic eye and her engineering mind creating something neither could have managed alone. A Christmas morning where we sat in matching pajamas, arms around each other, surrounded by wrapping paper. Most surprising were the candid shots of me that someone, my mother, had captured without my knowledge. Me lost in concentration, sketching at the kitchen table. Me laughing with friends at a high school art show. Me at my RISD graduation, face alight with accomplishment. Tucked between pages were mementos I'd never seen preserved, a newspaper clipping about an art contest I'd won in 9th grade, a printout of a blog that had featured my early design work, even the article from Design Quarterly I thought they'd ignored. And then, almost hidden in the back of the album, I found a folder containing drawings from my childhood, imaginative creatures, colorful landscapes, abstract explorations of shape and line. Each was dated in my mother's neat handwriting, some accompanied by notes: Alexandra's first use of perspective, age 8, or notice the sophisticated color theory already emerging. The last item in the album stopped my breath entirely, a letter in my father's distinctive handwriting, addressed to the admissions office at RISD, that I'd never known existed. While my daughter Alexandra's test scores speak to her academic abilities, he had written, they cannot capture her extraordinary creative vision and unique perspective that make her an ideal candidate for your program. Where others see ordinary objects, Alexandra perceives connections and possibilities that transform the commonplace into the remarkable. The letter continued for 2 pages, making a passionate case for my admission, a father's pride laid bare in a way he had never expressed directly to me. I sat back, the album open on my lap, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't the narrative I'd constructed about my family over the years. These weren't the parents who had never valued me, the sister who had only seen me as competition. Had I been wrong all along? Or was the truth more complicated than either version of the story? Dawn was breaking by the time I closed the album, my mind churning with questions. I moved to my desk, pulled out a sketchbook I'd abandoned months ago, and began to draw, not for a client or a project, but for myself. Images flowed from my pencil without conscious direction: childhood homes, family scenes, abstract representations of emotions too complex for words. I lost track of time, emerging from the creative trance only when my phone rang around noon. I almost ignored it, but the caller ID showed Samuel Cohen, my elderly neighbor from across the hall who occasionally asked for help with technology issues. "Good afternoon, Samuel," I answered, suddenly aware of how hoarse my voice sounded from disuse. "Alexandra, dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice carrying the gentle accent of his Hungarian childhood. "I was wondering if you might help me order groceries online. My arthritis is acting up today." "Of course," I said, realizing I hadn't spoken to another human in days. "I can come over now if that works." Samuel, at 84, had lived in the building longer than any other resident. A retired philosophy professor, he'd lost his wife 5 years earlier but maintained an active mind and a quiet wisdom that I'd come to value during our interactions. When I arrived at his apartment, he took one look at me and said, "You look terrible, my dear. Sit down. I'll make us tea." I started to protest, but he waved away my objection. "The grocery order can wait." Some things are more important. His apartment was a testament to a life fully lived, walls lined with books, photos of family spanning generations, artifacts from his travels around the world. He moved slowly but deliberately, preparing a pot of fragrant tea and arranging cookies on a plate. "Now," he said as he placed the tea service on the coffee table between us, "tell me what's troubling you." I've seen that look before, the one that says a person is at war with themselves. Perhaps it was his gentle manner, or the safety of confiding in someone outside the situation, but I found myself telling Samuel everything: the dinner confrontation, the years of feeling inadequate, the revelations from the photo album. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or offering a comforting sound of understanding. When I finally fell silent, he took a thoughtful sip of tea before responding. "You know, Alexandra, I fled Hungary in 1956 during the revolution. I left behind everything: my home, my possessions, my identity. For years, I defined myself by what I had lost, by the way others saw me, as a refugee, an immigrant, always an outsider. It was only when I began to question who I wanted to be, rather than who others expected me to be, that I began to truly live." "How did you do it?" I asked. "How did you figure out who you wanted to be?" He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "By recognizing that we are not static beings. The self is not something to discover, like a treasure buried in the earth. It is something we create, daily, through our choices and actions. The question is not who am I, but who am I becoming?" His words resonated in a way that made me sit straighter. I've spent so much time reacting against who my parents wanted me to be that I'm not sure I know who I want to be. "That's a wonderful place to start," he said, patting my hand. "Uncertainty is the beginning of wisdom." As I helped Samuel with his grocery order afterward, his philosophical perspective continued to work through my mind. I'd been defining myself in opposition to my family for so long. What would it mean to define myself on my own terms? The question followed me back to my apartment, where the open sketchbook still waited on my desk. I looked at the drawings I'd created in the early morning hours, raw, emotional, authentic in a way my professional work rarely had space to be. Something clicked into place. I picked up my phone and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I made an appointment with a therapist whose card Rachel had given me after my last relationship ended. Dr. Irene Mitchell's office was in a converted Victorian house in the center of town, with a waiting room that felt more like a comfortable living room than a medical facility. She herself was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an attentive presence that immediately put me at ease. "What brings you here today, Alexandra?" she asked once we were seated in her office. "I'm not sure who I am," I said, the honesty of the statement surprising even me. "I mean, I know who I am in reaction to others: the rebellious daughter, the less successful sister, the creative one in a family of pragmatists. But I don't know who I am just for me." Dr. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "That's a profound realization, and a brave one to voice. Let's start there." Over the next few sessions, we explored the patterns that had shaped my life, how I'd internalized my parents' critical voice, how I'd made choices either to please them or to defy them, rarely for my own authentic reasons. "We develop these patterns as children to protect ourselves," Dr. Mitchell explained. "They serve us then, but often limit us as adults." "So how do I break the patterns?" I asked. "First by recognizing them. Then by practicing new ways of being, new ways of relating, to your family, yes, but more importantly to yourself." She assigned exercises that felt both simple and terrifying. "Make one decision each day based solely on what I want, not on external expectations. Write down critical thoughts and question their origins. Create art that expressed my emotions rather than my skills." The art directive particularly challenged me. As a professional designer, I was accustomed to creating for clients, for specific purposes. Creating purely for emotional expression felt foreign, almost transgressive. "That's exactly why it's important," Dr. Mitchell said when I admitted this difficulty. "Your art has become another area where you seek validation. Let's reclaim it as a space for authentic self-expression." Slowly, painfully, I began to unravel the knots that had bound me, to expectations, to comparisons, to the constant seeking of approval I might never receive. In our fourth session, Dr. Mitchell asked a question that stopped me cold. Alexandra, what would you do, who would you be, if you truly believed you were enough exactly as you are? I had no immediate answer. The question followed me home, echoed in my mind as I tried to sleep, surfaced again as I moved through the following days. What would it mean to be enough? To act from that place of inherent worthiness rather than from the deficit I'd carried for so long? One evening, about 6 weeks after the confrontation with my family, I found myself opening the email drafts I'd begun and abandoned multiple times, messages to my parents and Charlotte that I couldn't quite bring myself to send. This time, with Dr. Mitchell's question echoing in my mind, I deleted the carefully constructed defenses and explanations I'd been crafting. Instead, I wrote from this new, tentative place of self-worth. I'm ready to talk. Not to defend or explain myself, but to listen and be heard. If you're willing to meet me with the same intention, I'll be at Riverside Cafe on Saturday at 2 p.m. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone and returned to the canvas I'd set up in the corner of my living room, my first painting in years, a swirl of colors and shapes that represented nothing but my own emotional landscape. As I added layers of paint, I realized that regardless of whether my family showed up on Saturday, I would be there, showing up for myself in a way I never had before. Saturday arrived with a clarity that seemed almost symbolic, the morning rain giving way to sunshine that cast long shadows across the city. I dressed with care, not in the professional armor I usually wore for family gatherings, but in clothes that felt authentically me, comfortable jeans, a soft sweater in my favorite shade of blue, silver earrings I'd bought from a street artist whose work had spoken to me. Riverside Cafe sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, its large windows overlooking the park where I'd fled the night of the confrontation. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a table in the back corner where we could talk with some privacy, and ordered a cappuccino I wasn't sure I could drink with my stomach in knots. At 1:55, Charlotte arrived, looking as nervous as I felt. She spotted me and headed over, stopping to order at the counter first, giving us both an extra moment to prepare. "Hi," she said, setting down her latte and sliding into the seat across from me. "Hi," I replied, suddenly unsure what to say next despite rehearsing this moment for days. "Thanks for coming." "Of course." She fidgeted with her coffee sleeve. "Our mom and dad?" "I don't know if they're coming," I admitted. "I invited them, but they didn't respond." Charlotte nodded, unsurprised. "Dad's been difficult. More than usual. Mom vacillates between defending him and crying. It's been tense." An awkward silence fell. We'd never been good at casual conversation, always performing for our parents rather than connecting with each other. "I looked at the album you brought," I said finally. Her expression brightened. "You did?" "I wasn't sure if you would." It was not what I expected. There were things in there I never knew existed. Dad's letter to RISD. All those newspaper clippings about my work. Charlotte smiled softly. "Mom's been collecting those since you were in middle school. She has a separate file folder in her office for bigger pieces that wouldn't fit in the album." I struggled to reconcile this information with the mother I thought I knew. She never mentioned it. "They're not good at expressing pride in ways that don't come with criticism attached," Charlotte acknowledged. "Especially Dad. But it's there." The cafe door opened, and we both looked up, tension returning. It wasn't our parents but a young couple with a stroller. I checked my watch, 2:10 p.m. "They might not come," I said, trying to keep the old hurt from my voice. "Give them a few more minutes," Charlotte suggested. "Traffic from their neighborhood is always bad on Saturdays." We sipped our coffees, the conversation shifting to safer topics, Charlotte's new condo renovations, a design project I was excited about. It felt strange, talking as adults with our own lives rather than as competitors in our parents' arena. At 2:17, the door opened again, and this time our parents entered. My mother spotted us first, nudging my father who was scanning the other side of the cafe. They made their way to our table, my mother's face a mixture of hope and trepidation, my father's carefully neutral. "Alexandra," my mother said, leaning down to kiss my cheek, a gesture I accepted stiffly. "You look well." My father nodded a greeting but said nothing as they settled into the remaining chairs. A server appeared to take their orders, black coffee for my father, herbal tea for my mother, and then we were left facing each other across the small table. "Thank you for coming," I began, falling back on politeness to navigate the uncharted waters. "Your mother insisted," my father said, earning a sharp look from both my mother and Charlotte. "Richard," my mother warned. We agreed. He exhaled sharply but fell silent. "We've been worried about you," my mother continued, turning back to me. "We didn't know if you were all right." "I'm okay," I said. I needed some time to think, to figure things out for myself. "We could have helped with that," my father interjected. "If you'd answered our calls instead of running away." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the defensive reaction his criticism always triggered. But instead of either shutting down or lashing out as I normally would, I tried something new. "I wasn't running away," I said calmly. I was creating space to hear my own thoughts without them being immediately questioned or dismissed. My father opened his mouth to respond, but my mother placed her hand over his. "We're here to listen, Richard. Remember?" He closed his mouth, clearly uncomfortable with this directive. The server returned with their drinks, creating another momentary reprieve from the tension. When she left, I took a deep breath and continued. "I've been seeing a therapist," I said, watching my father's expression shift to one of concern. In our family, therapy had always been viewed as a sign of weakness. "She's been helping me understand some patterns in our family dynamic that haven't been healthy for me." "What patterns?" my mother asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. "The constant comparison between Charlotte and me. The way my achievements have always been measured against hers instead of valued on their own merits. The subtle and not-so-subtle messages that my career choice, my lifestyle, my whole way of being in the world is somehow less valid, less worthy of respect." My father shifted uncomfortably. "We've always wanted what's best for you." "I know that's what you believe," I acknowledged. "But what's best for me isn't the same as what's best for Charlotte, or what was best for you." "I'm different, Dad." "Not wrong or less, just different." "We never said you were less," he protested. "You're not half the woman your sister is," I quoted back to him. "Those were your exact words." He had the grace to look ashamed. I was frustrated. "I didn't mean it literally." "But you meant something by it," I pressed. "What did you mean, Dad?" The direct question seemed to catch him off guard. He stared into his coffee for a long moment before responding. "I meant that you're not living up to your potential. That you could be more successful if you applied yourself differently." "More successful by whose definition?" I asked. "Because by mine, I am successful. I do work I'm proud of. I support myself doing something I love. I have creative freedom and professional respect in my field." "But the financial instability," he began. "Is something I've planned for," I interrupted. "I have savings, investments, insurance. I'm not reckless just because I've chosen a different path than the corporate track you value." My mother looked surprised. "You have investments?" "Yes, Mom. I've been saving for a down payment for the last 3 years. My accountant helped me set up a SEP IRA. I have health insurance through the Freelancers Union. I'm a responsible adult, even if I don't fit your image of what that looks like." My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "We didn't know," my mother said softly. "You never asked," I pointed out. "You assumed." Charlotte, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I think what Alex is saying is that we've all been operating on assumptions rather than really talking to each other. I'm guilty of it too." My father turned to her, betrayal evident in his expression. "You're taking her side now?" "It's not about sides, Dad," Charlotte said with unexpected firmness. "It's about acknowledging that there's been a problem in how our family communicates. How we relate to each other. I benefited from it, so it was easier to stay quiet, but that doesn't make it right. My father looked between us, outnumbered for perhaps the first time in family discussions. Something in his expression shifted, not quite surrender, but a grudging recognition that the dynamics were changing whether he approved or not. "Your mother and I only pushed you because we saw your potential," he said, addressing me directly. "When you were little, your teachers told us you had one of the highest IQs they'd seen. We didn't want that wasted on drawing pictures." "It wasn't wasted, Dad," I said gently. "It was channeled into work that fulfills me. And those pictures have built a business that supports me and creates value for my clients." He shook his head, unconvinced but at least listening. "Richard," my mother said suddenly, "tell Alexandra about your father." My father's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of warning and vulnerability I'd never seen before. "Evelyn, that's not relevant." "I think it is," she insisted. We sat in uncomfortable silence, my father clearly wrestling with something internally. Finally, he sighed and looked at me. "My father was hard to please," he said, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Nothing I did was ever good enough. Second place was failure. A minus might as well have been an F. When I brought home a scholarship to state instead of the Ivy League schools my cousins attended, he didn't speak to me for a week. I listened, stunned. In all my life, I'd never heard my father speak of his own father this way. I promised myself I'd never be that kind of father," he continued, a bitter edge to his laugh. "I guess some patterns are harder to break than others." "Why didn't you ever tell us this?" Charlotte asked. "What good would it have done?" he replied. "The point was to be better, not to make excuses." "Understanding isn't the same as excusing," I said quietly. My father looked at me sharply, then away. "Maybe not." My mother reached across the table toward me, not quite touching but bridging the distance. "We don't want to lose you, Alexandra. Either of you," she added, glancing at Charlotte. "If we need to adjust how we communicate, we can try." "It's more than communication, Mom," I said. "It's about respect. About valuing differences instead of just tolerating them until they can be corrected." My father was still struggling, that much was obvious. But when he finally spoke, I heard something new in his voice, a tentative effort to understand rather than to convince. "These investments you mentioned," he said. "What are you investing in?" It wasn't an apology or a profound transformation. But it was a step, my father asking about my life on my terms instead of immediately critiquing it. I explained my modest but growing portfolio, the strategies my accountant had suggested for self-employed professionals. He listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions, sometimes nodding when I mentioned a company he approved of. The conversation gradually expanded, my mother joining in with questions about my recent projects, Charlotte sharing her own thoughts more freely than I'd ever witnessed in family discussions. It wasn't perfect, my father still occasionally slipped into critical comments that made me tense, but when I calmly pointed these out instead of either absorbing or exploding over them, he made visible efforts to redirect. After nearly 2 hours, as our empty cups accumulated and the afternoon light shifted, I realized we had managed something unprecedented, an honest conversation where no one stormed out or shut down. It wasn't resolution, but it was the beginning of something new. "We should do this again," my mother suggested as we prepared to leave. "Maybe dinner next week?" "At a restaurant," she added hastily, recognizing that neutral territory was still important. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Outside the cafe, my mother hugged me, a real embrace rather than the perfunctory gesture that usually marked our goodbyes. My father, still uncomfortable with the new emotional terrain, settled for an awkward pat on my shoulder. "You know," he said gruffly as they turned to leave, "that brewery design you showed us online. It's distinctive. In a good way." Coming from my father, it was practically a standing ovation. As they walked to their car, Charlotte lingered beside me. "That went better than I expected," she said. "It's a start," I agreed. "A small one." Small starts can lead to big changes, she replied. Isn't that what you always said about design, that the initial concept is just the beginning? I smiled at her reference to my work philosophy. When did you start listening to my design theories? I've always listened, Alex. I just didn't always know how to show it. We walked together toward the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows ahead of us. For the first time I could remember, the silence between us felt comfortable rather than competitive. 6 months can change everything and nothing at all. The seasons turned, winter yielding reluctantly to spring, then blooming into full summer. My design business evolved in ways I hadn't anticipated, each project building on the authenticity I'd begun to reclaim in those first vulnerable painting sessions. Instead of chasing clients whose prestige might impress my parents, I focused on collaborations that genuinely excited me, small businesses with unique visions, artists transitioning into entrepreneurship, community organizations doing meaningful work. My portfolio became more eclectic, more distinctively mine, and paradoxically, more successful. Marissa Chen, a former classmate who'd launched a boutique design agency, reached out after seeing my redesign for a local brewery. Your work has changed, she observed over coffee. There's something different about it now. More, you. I'm letting myself be more visible in it, I explained, struggling to articulate the shift. Less concerned with proving something, more focused on creating something authentic. She offered me a partnership, not an employment position but a true creative collaboration that would give me both stability and freedom. After careful consideration, I accepted. It wasn't the corporate path my father would have chosen for me, but it was right for who I was becoming. My relationship with Charlotte transformed most dramatically. The carefully maintained distance I'd always kept, part resentment, part self-protection, gave way to something more genuine. We began meeting regularly, not from obligation but from choice, discovering the adults we'd become beyond our parents' influence. I've decided to take a sabbatical next year, she confided during one of our Sunday brunches. To volunteer with an ocean conservation group in the Galapagos Islands. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? What about junior partnership? What did Dad say? She laughed, a free sound I couldn't remember hearing from her before. Dad thinks I'm having a midlife crisis at 33. Mom's worried about strange diseases. But they'll adjust. The marine biology dream, I murmured, remembering our conversation that night in my apartment. Not quite the same as studying it academically, she clarified. But a start. A way to reconnect with what I loved before I got so caught up in being who everyone expected me to be. I'm proud of you, I told her, meaning it without reservation. My parents' evolution was slower, more uneven. My mother adapted more readily, making visible efforts to show interest in my work without immediately suggesting improvements. She came to an exhibition where some of my personal artwork, the paintings that had begun as therapy assignments, were displayed alongside my commercial designs. These are so expressive, Alexandra, she said, standing before a particularly emotional piece. I had no idea you could paint like this. Neither did I admitted. Not until recently. My father's journey was more challenging. Decades of patterns didn't dissolve overnight, and sometimes our interactions still ended in frustration. But he was trying, in his way. He'd invited me to his office to discuss the potential redesign of his company's marketing materials, not offering me the job automatically, which would have been patronizing, but asking for a professional consultation. Your presentation was impressive, he told me afterward, in the closest approximation to pride I'd ever heard from him. Very strategic. I didn't realize how much business analysis goes into what you do. It wasn't the unconditional approval I'd once desperately craved, but I was learning that such approval was neither possible nor necessary. What mattered more was the mutual respect slowly developing between us. Christmas brought another test, the first major holiday since our confrontation. We gathered at my parents' house, the familiar setting highlighting both how much and how little had changed. The dining room still featured my mother's best china, the tree still displayed the same ornaments from my childhood, my father still carved the turkey with precision. But other things were different. Charlotte's doctor boyfriend was absent, they'd broken up, a decision she'd made after realizing how much of herself she'd been compromising in that relationship too. Instead, she'd brought her new rescue dog, Baxter, who disrupted the usual formality by begging for scraps and shedding on the upholstery. The most significant change was less visible, the conversation that flowed around the table. My father still dominated at times, but when he began to slip into comparative comments, he caught himself more often than not. My mother asked genuine questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. Charlotte and I exchanged glances occasionally, private communications that acknowledged both progress and lingering tensions. After dinner, while Charlotte helped my mother with dishes, another break from tradition, in the past, that duty would have fallen solely to the girls, my father invited me into his study. This wood-paneled room had always been his sanctuary, a place I'd entered only when summoned, usually for some conversation about my disappointing life choices. He seemed awkward now, arranging books on his desk that didn't need arranging. "I've been doing some reading," he finally said, gesturing to a small stack of books on his side table. I glanced at the titles, surprised to see The Artist's Way and Daring Greatly among them. "That's not your usual reading material." "Your mother's therapist recommended them," he admitted gruffly. At my startled look, he added, "Yes, your mother's been seeing someone too. She thought it might help us understand things." "And does it?" I asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question with the same careful attention he'd give a complex business problem. "Some of it seems like nonsense," he said finally. "But some of it makes me think about how I might have approached things differently. With you. With your sister. Even in my own life." He moved to his filing cabinet and withdrew a yellowed folder. "I found these recently. I'd forgotten I had them." Inside were drawings, childish, colorful creations I recognized as my own early work. Crayon compositions, watercolor landscapes, pencil sketches of imaginary creatures. Each was dated in my father's precise handwriting. "You kept these?" I asked, astonished. "You gave them to me," he said simply. "Every Father's Day, every birthday, for years. Until you stopped." I remembered now, presenting my father with my latest creation, watching his face for a reaction, receiving a polite "Thank you, Alexandra," before the drawing disappeared into his briefcase. I'd assumed they'd been discarded, like so much else I'd created. "I stopped because I thought you didn't care about them," I said. He looked genuinely surprised. "Of course I cared. I kept every one. But you never said anything. Never displayed them." "I didn't know how," he admitted. My father would have dismissed such things as frivolous. "I didn't want to discourage you, but I didn't know how to. I didn't have the vocabulary for encouragement without critique." We stood in silence, the weight of decades of misunderstanding between us. "I'm not good at this, Alexandra," he said finally. "The emotional discussions. The processing, as your mother calls it. But I am trying." It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation scene from a movie, with tears and embraces and profound declarations of love. But it was real, a genuine moment of connection with the complicated, flawed man who was my father. "I know, Dad," I said. "I see that you're trying. I am too." Back in the dining room, my mother had brought out a photo album, not the one Charlotte had shown me, but a new one she'd been compiling. "For both my girls," she explained, showing us photographs from the past 6 months, our Sunday brunches, family dinners, ordinary moments captured with new attention. Looking at these images side by side with the older photographs revealed how far we'd come, the rigid poses and strained smiles of the past giving way to more authentic expressions, more natural groupings. We weren't a perfect family and never would be. But we were learning, slowly and imperfectly, to see and accept each other as we actually were. Later that evening, as Charlotte and I sat on the front porch swing, watching Baxter explore the garden, I thought about the journey of the past 6 months. "Do you think people really change?" I asked her. "Or do we just learn to manage our expectations better?" She considered the question thoughtfully. Both, maybe? I don't think Dad will ever be the warm, fuzzy father from sitcoms. And Mom will always worry too much about appearances. But they're trying to meet us where we are instead of where they think we should be. That's change, isn't it? I nodded, watching the stars emerge in the winter sky. And us? Have we changed? You have, she said with certainty. You stand taller. Speak more directly. Your work has a confidence it didn't have before. And you're running off to the Galapagos to play with sea lions, I teased. She laughed. Better late than never to follow a passion, right? We sat in comfortable silence, the swing creaking gently beneath us. The Charlotte I'd grown up envying and resenting had become someone I genuinely admired, not for her achievements or perfection, but for her courage in questioning the path she'd followed so diligently. And perhaps she saw something similar in me, not the rebellious, underachieving sister, but someone who had found her own way despite the pressure to conform. We're going to be okay, aren't we? She asked, a rare vulnerability in her voice. I think we already are, I replied. Not perfect. Not finished growing or healing. But okay. More than okay. Later that night, I looked at an old family photo taken when I was about 12, all of us posed formally in front of the Christmas tree, smiles fixed, positions assigned by height and importance. Beside it on my phone was a new image my mother had taken earlier that evening, Charlotte and I on the porch swing, laughing at something, completely unposed and unself-conscious, with Baxter photobombing from below. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The journey from that first image to the second had been long and painful, but sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, I understood something I'd been struggling to articulate in therapy for months. Self-worth doesn't come from comparison. It doesn't come from meeting someone else's standards or even from rebellion against those standards. It comes from within, from the daily choice to live authentically, to create meaningfully, to connect honestly with yourself and others. My family was still flawed, still complicated, still learning how to love each other without conditions or comparisons. So was I. The work wasn't finished and perhaps never would be. But we had begun, and that beginning had changed everything. The words my father had spoken at that fateful dinner, "You're not half the woman your sister is," no longer held the devastating power they once had. Because I finally understood that my value wasn't measured in fractions of someone else. It was whole, complete, and entirely my own. I closed the photo album and picked up my sketchbook instead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to practice the boundaries and self-respect I was still learning to maintain. But tonight, I would create simply for the joy of creation, not to prove my worth, but to express it. Have you ever felt compared to someone in your life? How did you break free from those comparisons and find your authentic self? Comment below and share your story. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of self-discovery and healing. And remember, your worth isn't defined by anyone else's measuring stick. You are complete, valuable, and enough exactly as you are. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.